Hey guys, welcome to Compact Coasterland 2. I'll drop the address in the description in case you want to come back and visit on your own. But today, we're going to check out this park, we're going to ride some roller coasters, and since we're here, why don't we talk about some anatomical etymology, specifically thorax and abdomen structures. After all, there's no place like an amusement park to get your heart beating and your stomach churning. Just to be clear, so we're all on the same page, when anatomists are talking about the chest, they use the term thorax. It is synonymous with those breastplates that the Roman gladiators used to wear, and it's defined by where the vertebrae and the sternum are connected by the ribs. And you might know sternum from the term breastbone. It's that strong bony structure located in the middle of your chest. And the sternum, even though it's a collection of bones, we give it a name because it helps the chest spread out. And that's probably where sternum came from. Stir means to spread out, and relative to the neck, the chest is much wider. Now, the sternum itself is made up of a series of bones. The manubrium being the one closest to the head, and the xiphoid bone being the one closest to the legs. And I'll talk about these bones in a little bit more detail in a minute, but for now, put your hand on the center of your chest and picture a sword with the handle at the top and the blade pointing down. Wow, okay, I hope you like that because there's a bunch of coasters coming up. Like I was saying before we got on that ride, in the center of your chest, there's a bony structure, the sternum, which gets its name relative to being wider than the neck. And it's a series of bones, but two of the bones, the one closest to your head and the one closest to your legs, get special names. And you can actually feel this bone in all mammals. So if you have a dog or a cat and you rub your hand along their chest, right underneath where you would expect to find their heart, you'll find this sternum as well. And for the most part, in all mammals, the sternum's the same. It's a series of bones, and we give a special name to the first and the last bone in the set. And remember how I told you to picture a sword sitting in your chest with the handle up towards your neck and the blade pointing down towards your legs? It's a perfect analogy. And in fact, the manubrium, which is the first bone up close towards your neck, gets its name from the word manus, which means hand. The reason being is that that particular bone kind of looks like a hilt or a handle of a sword. You know the term humanoid? And it's human plus oid, and the oid part kind of implies that it's sort of like a human, but it's not actually a human. The word xiphoid does the exact same thing. Xiphos means sword, and oid means like. So literally, the xiphoid bone means like a sword. And since the xiphoid bone has a big long process that comes off of it, it kind of looks like a sword blade. And together, the entire sternum kind of looks like a sword, with the manubrium being the handle and the xiphoid being the blade. All right, now your vertebrae runs down your back, and if you put your hand so that your fingers touch the bony parts in the middle of your back, you can feel with your palm some muscles. That's actually a collection of multiple muscles, and they make up three different systems. There's transversospinalis, longissimus, and iliocostalis system of muscles. And while the names of these systems of muscles tell you where they originate and insert, your love of tacos will actually remind you the order that they come in. All right, so what was I talking about? Oh, right, tacos. So I love tacos is a great little way to remember the order of the three different systems of muscles in your back. Iliocostalis, longissimus, transversospinalis systems. Now in humans, we would say that that's going from anterior to posterior. Anterior being the belly, posterior being towards the back. In almost all other mammals, because they're quadrupeds and they walk on all four legs, we would say that they go from ventral to dorsal. Great, so now you know the order, but what about the names of the actual systems of muscles? Well, the iliocostalis system has that word costalis in it, right? Costa, which we said before meant ribs. The ilium part, the ilio part, is actually the ilium bone, and that's part of the pelvis. So this tells you that this system of muscles connects the ilium to the ribs. The longissimus system gets its name because it's the longest set. It goes from the ilium all the way up to the cervical vertebrae. And transversospinalis muscle gets its name because the muscles connect from the transverse processes to the spinous processes of the vertebrae. Now those are the three different systems of muscles that are located on the back. But between the ribs themselves is also two different sets of muscles. Because they're between the ribs, they're called intercostal, between ribs. There's an external and an internal, and the external have been associated with inspiration, while the internal have been associated with expiration. Now there's some pretty important vessels located in the thorax, and I want to talk about veins for just a second. If you go back to the Iliad and Odyssey time when Homer was describing anatomy, he'll refer to this structure called the hollow vein. This is a reference to a structure we now call the vena cava. And it does take a little bit of historical context to appreciate this naming convention. Because of the way that early anatomists prepared cadavers, all arteries and veins were empty. But this isn't why Homer refers to the vena cava as the hollow vein. Instead, he means hollow in the context of swollen and big. And the vena cava is definitely a large vessel. It is a swollen vessel. It is the last vessel before blood returns to the heart. So you can probably imagine that if you are the last vessel that all blood in the entire body collects in before it returns to the heart, you're probably going to be a pretty big structure. And in all mammals, there's two, a cranial vena cava and a caudal vena cava, that come together to combine. It's so big, in fact, that Aristotle actually referred to it as the great vessel. Now there's another big vein in the thorax, and when we get off this ride, remind me to talk about cows. Oh, right. Besides the cranial and caudal vena cava, there's actually another vessel, the azygos vein. And the azygos vein gets its name specifically because it literally means not paired. The Zygos part means two or pairing, and the A prefix means not this, so not paired. And I said I would talk about cows. The reason why I say that is because cows actually have two azygous veins, and you would think that because they have two, they'd call it the left and right zygous vein. Nope, it's the left and right azygous vein. Oh, hold on, just give me a second. Now, we define the borders of the thorax by the location of the ribs, but where exactly does thorax become abdomen? Anatomically, that border is defined by the diaphragm, but the etymology of the term diaphragm is a bit suspicious. It has been used to describe the midriff, or kind of the waist area, the heart, and the mind across different time periods. While the most common explanation for the word diaphragm's origin may just be folk etymology, it is at least a good story to help us remember the anatomy, which we'll go over in just a second. While the origin of the word diaphragm is a bit unclear, the story goes that phrasin, which, thank you, my ancient Greek is fantastic, means to fence off. And it would make sense that the diaphragm would mean to fence off because it separates two important chambers of the body, the thorax and the abdomen. Now, the nerve that innervates the diaphragm is referred to as the phrenic nerve, and its origin is equally dubious. Phrenic literally means pertaining to the fence. So why would I share these possibly inaccurate etymologies for diaphragm and phrenic? It's because it's helpful for remembering the openings within the diaphragm. The diaphragm itself contains three natural openings: the caval foramen, the aortic and esophageal hiatus. Now, part of these terms are defined by the big prominent structure passing through them, but the other part is the foramen and hiatus terminology, and the difference between those things has to do with how the structure is formed. Foramen means hole, while hiatus means gap. So in the case of the caval foramen, it is a single opening inside of a single tissue type, the tendon of the diaphragm, whereas the esophageal and aortic hiatuses are actually a hole located between two different muscles that form together to make a natural opening. And since we're talking about the diaphragm, now would be just as good of time as any to mention the diaphragmatic crus. Just like you might call the tibia and fibula the crus of the limb, so is the legs of the diaphragm. I think the sun's getting a bit low, so how about after we get off this coaster, we get back to talking about Cupid. Oh, I just loved that. Speaking of which, Cupid, how fitting. The god of love and the god of war would have a kid who would become the god of desire. It's so sad that your image was hijacked to sell products of romance. Is it karma for the so many of your stories are just reinterpretations of Eros, the Greek god of love? That might be unfair. You've given us just so much. Okay, so maybe that sounded like sarcasm. But the little line of our upper lip with the bend, that's named after your bow, Cupid's bow. But I know, that's not what you're famous for. You think Cupid, you think hearts. So let's talk about the heart. It's an Old English term. It's likely associated with the Proto-Indo-European root word curd, which gave us words like cordial and cardiac, both of which kind of come down to pertaining to the heart. And yes, like you, Cupid, the true origin of some of the words is questionable, but helpful for remembering their meaning. So let's not linger on love and instead circle about the heart's anatomical parts and their associated structures. The heart sits within an area of the body called the mediastinum. Mediastinum comes from media, meaning middle, and stare, meaning to stand. Literally meaning to stand in the middle of the thorax. Now, the heart isn't the only thing located in the mediastinum. It also includes the esophagus, the phrenic and cardiac nerves, the thoracic duct, the thymus and lymph nodes, as well as the trachea, the latter of which gets its name from that time when arteries and veins were indistinguishable. They were simply air ducts that air moved through. And since the trachea is also empty and it appeared as if air moved through it, early anatomists called it tracheus arteria, the rough artery. But since it's not an artery, the artery part was dropped, and we've just retained the trachea name. But the heart is arguably the most complicated organ of the mediastinum, and the mammalian heart consists of 4 chambers, 2 atrium, and 2 ventricles. But perhaps the naming of the anatomical structures of the heart make the most sense if we follow it in order of blood flowing through it. As I was saying, the mammalian heart is broken into 4 chambers, 2 atrium and 2 ventricles. The atriums are located prior to each ventricle on the left and right side. We see this word first used around the 1870s for anatomical purposes, but 200 years earlier it was being used to describe the main room of a Roman house, that is, the room that would contain the hearth with a fire. The term ventricle, however, shows up much earlier than that. Around the 1350s, it's used to describe a small organ cavity. The root word venter means belly, and ventricle just means little belly. And yeah, this is why the term ventral means towards the belly. But you should take note that nothing about the word ventricle implies the heart. And an anatomist would say, to be specific, you should in fact use the term ventriculus cordis, as cordis includes the Latin for heart, and ventriculus simply tells you that it is a small chamber. Surrounding the heart is a structure called the pericardium. This is 2 parts, peri and cardium. Peri meaning around, and again cardium meaning heart, so literally around the heart. The pericardium contains multiple layers, a parietal and a visceral, with a pericardial cavity located between the two. Now don't get confused by the terms parietal and visceral. Their intent is to actually describe where they are in relation to each other, or rather I should say where they are in relation to other structures. Parietal means pertaining to the wall, while visceral means pertaining to the inner. So parietal pericardium simply means pertaining to the wall side of the sac around the heart, whereas visceral means pertaining to the inner side of the sac around the heart. I know, I said I would describe things in terms of their flow of blood through the heart, so let's back up and dive in. Okay, so you're traveling with blood through the caudal or cranial vena cava, and you've entered into the right atrium. You're going to be passing into the right ventricle, and to do so, you have to move through a valve, named the atrioventricular valve, for the 2 chambers. But it's also sometimes called the tricuspid valve because the valves contain 3 leaflets. Within the ventricles lies muscles called the papillary muscles, literally nipple muscles, and are connected to the valves via chordae tendineae or cords of tendons. When early anatomists first started opening up hearts in dogs, pigs, humans, but most notably sheep, a band within the right ventricle could be occasionally found. It was initially proposed to inhibit expansion of the chamber. However, physiological studies showed evidence of conduction continuing from the right branch of the atrioventricular bundle A more modern proposal suggests that because the right ventricle has a thinner wall, a shortcut was needed to synchronize ventricular contraction with the left ventricle. It is therefore its unique location and unclear purpose that gives the moderator band its name, but I much prefer its anatomical name of septomarginal trabecula, meaning the beam pertaining to the margin of the septum. As the ventricles start to contract, so do the papillary muscles. This causes the chordae tendineae to pull on the valves and close the opening between the atrium and the ventricle. With the right atrioventricular valve closed, contraction of the right ventricle causes blood to move away from the atrium out through the pulmonary valve into pulmonary circulation. That is to say, blood is now sent towards the lungs to receive oxygen and become oxygenized. When it returns back to the left atrium, it then moves through the left atrioventricular valve, or the bicuspid valve, named because there are 2 leaflets instead of 3 like in the tricuspid valve. It's also sometimes called the mitral valve. The reason for this third name is because early anatomists noted that the valves of the left atrioventricular valve looked like the hat that a bishop would wear, called a mitre. The left atrioventricular valve is controlled in a similar fashion to the way the right atrioventricular valve is controlled. The biggest difference is that blood leaving the left ventricle exits through an aortic valve into the aorta, and it has been proposed that this term comes from Latin and Greek words meaning to hang something up or possibly to lift or raise. As blood hits the aortic arch, it makes a sharp turn, some of which gets redirected to other structures via vessels such as the brachiocephalic arteries and subclavian arteries. Subclavian artery gets its name for being under the clavicle, while as the brachiocephalic artery gets its name for its relationship to the arms, brachio, and cephalic, head. This is not to be confused with terms such as brachycephalic, which is what we call those smushed-faced animals, like pugs and Persian cats, brachycephalic literally translating as short head. With the exception of the blood that will fall back to the heart and enter in through the coronary or crown arteries, the rest of the blood will travel through the aorta to the abdomen. But you know what? It's been a long day, so let's take a break, enjoy the ride, and we'll come back later to talk about the anatomical structures of the abdomen, and we can explore the rest of this park.